Hello, my name is Isaac Christopher Lubogo, and I take time to engage in legal scholarism. So the purposes of this is to kind of introduce you to our website, lubogo.org, or you can also use sugeneislawup.com, where we've been able to publish a number of books. I think probably 7 now running. We began with treatise to my learned friend, the attorney at law, and then we also talked about Ubuntu Bulamu and the law, and then we also have another one which is called Intelligent Design, specifically and the African ontological and epistemological ethics, where we discuss legal philosophical discourse in terms of African jurisprudence, if you like. Then we also have one that is coming up soon called Forensic Law in Uganda, but particularly this one that I'm talking about today is one that we call the Executive Constitutional Mandate, which basically talks about demystifying the fountain of honor, presidential power overreach in Uganda. And I'd like to begin by just sharing a few items here from this wonderful book. It's dedicated to Solis Populi, Solis Dei, which means the welfare of the people is supreme. And the book is dedicated to all those innocent souls, the unsung heroes of this nation who have actually given their lives, blood, tears, and sweat for this nation. God bless their soul. Now, perhaps something about the book. If I may read something about the book, the first thing I would like to ask my readers is to imagine a different president in office. If, for example, they support the current president and believe that those who oppose him are actually doing it for purposes of partisan reasons or maybe illegitimate reasons, then ideally they should visualize a president whom they completely distrust. Conversely, if on the other hand they actually trust the president, then they should look at this exercise as one that is intended to focus or maybe question the underlying constitutional issues of presidential policies. So this exercise is necessary because at the end of the day, I offer certain suggestions on how to, for example, alleviate some of these challenges. And I don't present this book perhaps as a silver bullet, but one that may be able to give certain ideas and ideals that may be fundamental in terms of how we can be able to create a constitutional dispensation that warranties this nation. So we may find that maybe certain things may need to be checked, if not reversed. I begin, for example, when I talk about my inbuilt personal thoughts. When I say that a story goes that Marcus Aurelius one time had an assistant to follow him as he walked through the Roman town square. The assistant's only role was to, whenever Marcus was actually praised to the, amongst his people, was to only to whisper in his ear and say, "You're only just a man. You're only just a man." The ideal thing here is to understand that humility is something that is supposed to be part of this presidency that I'm talking about here. So, and I want also to continue by talking about what my friend Brain Hubbard said. He said the capacity to learn is a gift, okay, and the ability to learn is a skill, but willingness to learn is a choice. In fact, Alvin Joffa once said that the literate of the 21st century will not be the individual who cannot read, but one who cannot learn to unlearn or even relearn. So that also becomes important. So these are things that I bring up specifically for you in terms of demystifying this particular concept in this book. This book has about 18 chapters. For example, chapter 1 talks about the unmasking the truth behind Uganda's name. Then the ideology of whether or not, where does Uganda get its flag, the colors, the black, yellow, red. I talk about the consolidation of the imperial colonial executive mandate. That is in chapter 1, plus other things. Then in chapter 2, I'm talking about the presidency, from historical times up to the present times. Chapter 3, I'm talking about constitutionalism, where we argue in terms of what is the constitution, what are the tenets of good constitutionalism. Then in chapter 4, I'm talking about things to do with when do we start this ideology of constitutional abrogation. Where it comes to the discussion of the ex parte Matovu case, some of you are probably aware about that. the dorsal case, the counting theory. I try to talk about the unmasking the legal positivism as opposed to executive political theory. Then I also discuss former President Godfrey Benaisa's the idiosyncratic justification of the body coup, and then the idea of the abandonment of the dominant executive political doctrine question. So these are discussed in chapter 4. When you come to chapter 5, I'm talking about issues to do with the presidency, the president's powers, the immunities, whether or not the president can also be, captured under the so-called presidential immunity, the ideology of delegated powers of the president, the inherent powers of the president, the ability to execute powers, aspect of life. When you go to chapter 6, I'm talking about the state of emergency, the idea that a president can declare a state of emergency, under what mandate, where does he get that authority, and what is the legality in terms of its dispensation. Okay, so then when you go to other chapters, for example, chapter 7, I'm talking about the evaluation of the executive as far as exercising the rule of law, the idealness of what they call the separation of power, whether or not it's still there, existent, or it's a myth. Then in chapter 8, I'm talking about executive overreaches. I'm talking about the abuse in terms of the abuse of the standard of presidential abuses that have taken place over a period of time. And I'm talking about the history way back from the promulgation of the 1962 Constitution up to the present time. You come to chapter 9, I'm talking about the army at the center of the executive, the militarization of the police, and an interesting doctrine that I bring into question here is what they call the Posse Comitatus doctrine. You will get to know about that when you read this book. Then I also talk about major cases that have taken root in this country. The motorbike killings, for example, the murder of women in Entebbe and Nansana, what went wrong, the border sagas, the ideal of the birth of the border sagas, those constant challenges that have been coming over a period of time because of the so many challenges in terms of border issues in this country. And then chapter 10, I'm talking about proper presidential mandates, the do's and the don'ts. What is a president mandated to do? Can a president be impeached? What are the tenets of impeachment? And I also make comparative analysis with other countries like America, where presidents have been impeached. So again, I use Uganda in terms of that to bring out those aspects. In chapter 11, I'm talking about the role of the legislature in checking the executive. Does the legislature still have this mandate? Do we have what they call parliamentary supremacy anymore? So I'm evaluating the role of the legislature in terms of guaranteeing that. Then the judiciary, the aspect of the judiciary. And here I introduce important topics because I'm talking about a judiciary that sometimes becomes more executive-minded than the executive itself. So I also argue in terms of those arguments in terms of the judiciary. Then chapter 13, I'm talking about being more constitutionally minded than executive, where I actually make references to most of the constitutional petitions that have been coming. And I choose specific interests of the dissenting judges of Justice Kakuru, Justice Ekirukubenza, Justice Mwambusha, Justice Mugamba, Justice Esther Chisache, Justice Sekoko, Justice Kanyahamba. Those arguments, mostly I'm impressed by the dissenting judges because they have importance in terms of the jurisprudence that they bring to us, and therefore it's important for us not to simply ignore them. Then I also talk about demystifying what they call the diminis non curat lex doctrine. That idea that of little things the law has no interest. I try to demystify those arguments. I talk about the institution of the amicus curiae doctrine and whether or not what is their place in court or in law today. Chapter 14, I'm talking about the absolute Buganda, and here I raise important questions of the so-called the crisis of Buganda, which happened in 1953 to 1955. Where interesting arguments are going to be found in terms of, for example, what happened to the Namasole crisis, the so-called untold Kabaka saga of the gonorrhea syphilis issue, the so-called adultery committed by one of the Kabakas. And those arguments, I also bring them into scholarism because this is jurisprudence now in a new form. I talk about the inexhaustible Buganda ghost, the idealness that perhaps was captured best by one of the Kabakas when he said the idealness and independence of Buganda still itches even up to today. I talk about the Kasuri Tom crisis, which I also argue in terms of the third Kabaka crisis, and then the Kabaka birthday crisis, the unsold story, the confrontation of the President Katikiro, and then the issue of the birthday coffin cake-like saga. All those arguments, I bring them up in that chapter. Then in chapter 15, I'm talking about the executive and religion, the idea that religion versus the state versus religion, because I bring in the argument that Vox Populi, Vox Dei, where we're arguing that the voice of the people is the voice of God. In other, the idea, what is supreme, state over church or church over state. I bring in the argument of the Mohammedan faith in Uganda, the Sekabaka Mutesa Islamization, the argument of the Muslim matters, by the way, in Namugongo, which many people may not have knowledge about. Then I also bring in the separation of the church and the state. And I also make comparative analysis with the church in England, how it migrated off from the Catholic Church. When Martin Luther actually decided to break off, the Protestant Revolution, I relate it to how also it came into our country here, Uganda. I talk about chapter 16, where I'm talking about not a mere change of arms, but a fundamental change. Was it a reality or a myth? And we also talk about the NRM reforms, the Bush War, some of the challenges, some of the appreciations that have been done by NRM. I also talk about why Dr. Kizza Besigye finds himself, out of it and why he dissented. I also talk about the NRM members of parliament, the rebel MPs. Then I talk about the issue, the wrangles that happened in the election of the member of parliament, particularly the office of the speakership. Those the wars that happened in between. Then I also talk about in chapter 17, where I'm talking about the political question in terms of whether or not, particularly whether or not we're actually in peace or we're in a semblance of peace. Because I quote something we call ubi solidinam facit passem appellate, which says they make dissolution and call it peace. Because I raised those important questions in terms of whether or not we actually have peace or a semblance of peace. Okay, and then chapter 18, I'm talking about electoral, democracy, where I'm arguing in terms of an evaluation of the constitutional right to an electoral democracy. The different right aspects of property, infringement of rights to personal property, as it were, the aspects of, I also make comparisons, by the way, in terms of electoral democracies in other jurisdictions, for example, like Kenya. And then I also talk about the infringement of the right to the internet as a fundamental right, whether or not that right was infringed upon. I also talk about aspects to do with how do you capture, pandemics, as it were. For example, the coronavirus and the likes. And then, of course, the initiation of emergency decrees vis-a-vis the Health Act. What were the mandate? What is the right procedure that someone's supposed to have followed? So in this book, which is almost 1,000+ pages, it's all these things are captured. So if I were you, I would definitely go to lugogo.org or go to suijournalistlaw.com, where you find some of these things that we discussed. So this is just the beginning of the many beautiful things that we intend to capture in this nation. So I thank you for giving me attention, and God bless you.